everyone. Welcome. This is Customizing Your CI/CD for Mobile. I'm Cecilia Martinez. I'm a developer advocate for AppFlow. Feel free to use the Q&A. We will have some time after to answer any questions. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. Again, I'm Cecilia Martinez. I'm a developer advocate for AppFlow, which is built by Ionic. AppFlow is a mobile DevOps platform for building, deploying, and automating your mobile CI/CD process. You can find me at Cecilia Creates on Twitter or on GitHub, or at Cecilia Martinez on LinkedIn. Before I joined the Ionic team, I worked at different companies like Cypress, which is for browser testing, and also Replay, which is a developer debugging tool. I've been very fortunate to work in open source developer tools, and I'm very passionate about those, providing a better developer experience. I also like to volunteer with underrepresented populations in tech. I am a lead volunteer with Women Who Code Front End. I am the chapter head for the Atlanta Out in Tech, which supports the LGBTQIA+ community in tech. And I was recognized by the GitHub Stars program for contributions to open source communities. So I talk about all of that and more, again, at Cecilia Creates on Twitter and GitHub. So feel free to connect with me on any of those platforms. What I'm here to talk to you about today, though, is mobile deployments. And if you've ever been involved with mobile deployments, you know that mobile deployments are very complex. You also may know that traditional CI/CD isn't designed for mobile. This can make it very difficult to have a streamlined mobile CI/CD process. So what we're going to talk about today is first, what makes mobile different? What makes mobile deployments so much more complex than traditional CI/CD and web deployments? We're also going to talk about the steps and considerations that you need to take for customizing your CI/CD for mobile. We'll also talk about the different options that you have for implementing your mobile CI/CD strategy. So let's get started by talking about what makes mobile different. With mobile deployments, you have to consider the different types of builds that you'll be creating. For traditional CI/CD, you typically have a one web build. You may have staging or QA or production, but for mobile, you need to consider building for native as well as potentially for a PWA or web build. When you're talking about native, for iOS, you'll need to consider the infrastructure requirements for hardware. You'll need to consider how you're going to procure Mac hardware for iOS. And then for Android, you can use like a Linux machine as well. You'll also need to consider how you're going to manage multiple potentially unreliable environments for your native builds. This includes managing build stacks, which has the software dependencies that you'll need in order to create those builds, as well as managing multiple different build types and platforms. Chances are you're not just creating a single native build, you may be managing multiple different types, versions, or flavors, depending on what platform that you're supporting. There's also shipping to consider. Shipping is very different for mobile than it is for traditional CI/CD. You can't ship in 10 minutes, you can't ship instantly. There's the App Store asset requirement and approval process to consider. There's also signing certificate management. And again, managing multiple release types and deployment channels. So not only do you have multiple types of builds to manage, but you may have different release types or channels that you're deploying to, and understanding how you're going to ship to those different channels. Because there's different approval processes for different app stores, like whether you're deploying to the Apple App Store, Google Play, or even specifically to certain devices, if you're doing an enterprise deployment or an ad hoc deployment, all of that needs to be considered because there's different requirements for different platforms. This could also mean that you ship at different times to whatever platform that you're shipping to, resulting in different experiences. Then there's maintenance. There's a long tail of app versions that you need to support. You can't necessarily force your users to update, so you'll need to ensure that everyone is having a good experience, no matter what version they have on their device. There's also upkeep with App Store requirements. There is continued updates to whether you need to have certain target SDKs in order to be discoverable in app stores or Google Play. There's also potentially security environment updates or things that you may need to update for your application. Then there's maintaining your build infrastructure and your dependencies, whether that means through configuration files or whether you have longstanding environments. These are things that you need to consider. Also, it's important to think about how you're going to maintain the actual quality of your application itself. Bug fixes and updates can be difficult to deploy, and an important quality strategy, whether that involves pre-deployment testing or ensuring that you have a deployment strategy that allows for rollbacks or quick bug fixes and updates, is important to consider. So all of these factors make mobile deployments different. And what this means for you is that cross-functional knowledge is required across teams, whether you're a mobile developer or whether you work on a DevOps or CI/CD or infrastructure team. You have to understand the considerations for both. So mobile development teams may not have all the context of the organizational infrastructure, security processes or requirements. And on the other side, if a traditional CI/CD or DevOps team that's used to deploying non-mobile applications may not understand or have context of all the specifications required. This can lead to delayed releases, and again, different developer experience or user experiences across platforms and development teams. If you have a web, iOS, and Android team, you may experience very different types of development processes, and then also for your end users as well across those platforms. So now we know what makes mobile deployments different. Let's talk about how you can customize your CI/CD for mobile. The first thing that you'll want to consider and plan for is your environments. So you'll have environments for building your native applications, as well as, again, a web version of mobile web, potentially. And so you'll have to think about how you're going to procure your Macs and Linux hardware. This can be physical hardware, a machine. It can also be a cloud environment, and it can be something that is longstanding or spun up on demand. For your build dependencies, you'll need to consider how you're going to install those in the environment that you have. You may want to leverage container images like Docker in order to ensure that you have all the correct versions of those dependencies that you can then install in a machine. Or you may need to manually install them with install commands using a dependency configuration file. Either way, they'll need to be maintained. If you're using container images and there is a required update to a dependency, you'll need to version those to ensure that you're using the most recent version, and also consider what platform and build type that you're using. If you're manually installing them, you may have multiple different configuration files or configuration objects within a single file that will then be referenced when you're installing the dependencies on that machine. This will include things like the specific version of Xcode or Android SDK that you need. And if you are targeting different versions, or you have minimum or maximum requirements, or you're building different versions in the same environment, you may need to install multiple versions of a dependency. So that's something else to consider. You also need to think about configuring your build environment. So not just the dependencies that are required, but things like environment variables, your SDK target levels, minimum and maximum. You may have different API endpoints depending on what build type. For example, you may be hitting a test API endpoint or a production one. You may have different build environments for dev, test, staging, prod. You may have beta versions, internal, external. All of those may have different configuration considerations that will need to be managed and make sure that you're using the correct build environments for the different build types. You can also leverage things like iOS schemes or Android variants, which are a combination of Android build types and product flavors, in order to manage all of these different environments and keep track of them. Next, we'll talk about builds. So this is going to be the actual process of building the native version of your application, the native binary, or the web build. So the first thing is going to think about the build types. For Android, there are debug and release build types by default, but chances are you may be using some kind of custom Android build type if you do have different versions that you need to support. For iOS, there's development, ad hoc, enterprise, and app store build types. Depending on what type of build type, you may also need to manage devices and have a provisioning profile in place. Then you'll think about initiating the build. That's going to include any build commands, how those are going to be run, and then also any configuration flags or environment variables that will happen at runtime. There's signing certificates to consider. That includes generating and managing certificates, provisioning profiles, again, for those devices and device registration, and installing the correct certificate in the environment. And certificates can be generated individually by developers, in their profiles in the Apple developer portal, or they can be managed across teams using a tool like Fastlane. So that's another consideration that you'll need to make and strategy to decide. Finally, there's what to do with the build artifacts, managing the binaries that get generated during the build, as well as any logs or screenshots or other artifacts that you'd like to generate. All of that will have to be taken into consideration in your CI/CD pipeline for mobile. Next, there's deployments. So I mentioned just a moment ago, App Store developer profiles. Within this App Store developer portal, you'll have to consider which platforms that you're going to deploy to, creating profiles. This is also going to be for Android as well, and credentials management, ensuring that whatever your build environment is has access to credentials. This can involve using developer APIs. There's various functionality in the developer APIs based on what platform that you're using. For example, in Android, you must upload the binary first in the console, and then you can push updates via the API. And you do have to decide which aspects that you'd like to automate via API versus things that you'd like to do manually. Sometimes there's things you just want to make sure that a human does. Other times you'll have to automate it via API, and making those decisions is something that you'll need to take into consideration. If you are using developer APIs, there's also the authentication and secret management within your environments. Depending on what type of cloud environment or manual environment that you're using, you may handle these differently with environment variables or need to encrypt them in certain ways with secret keys. You also have app profiles and assets to consider, things like update messages, screenshots, icons, and descriptions, how you'll store these assets and make sure that they're up to date and coincide with the deployment process. Finally, you'll need to consider upload tools. There's various options based on your platform, including third-party CLI tools, again, like Fastlane, and deciding which type of upload tools that you'd like to use in order to deploy to the app stores, or again, to specific devices if you're using internal or enterprise application releases. Then there's updates. Having a really solid update strategy is important for mobile deployments because, again, you can't just necessarily roll back to a previous version and deploy instantly the same way you can with web and traditional CI/CD. This includes considering how you'll version your releases, how often you're going to release, what types of release or updates you'll have for your user, and how often you will deploy things like minor releases or patches, major releases with new feature updates, and more. You also have to consider rollbacks. If something does get deployed that has a mission critical bug, is there going to be an easy way for you to revert that? Are you able to update quickly, or with your current release cadence, what kind of impact could that have on your user? That will also, decisions that you have with your rollbacks may also impact your testing strategy. If you are able to use update quickly, then you may have less testing versus if you're not able to roll back quickly, you may have more rigorous testing before you actually release. Same thing for bug fixes, understanding how you can push those out to users, and also understanding the update App Store approval process. There are things like long-standing apps that may not receive updates, but will still have requirements for target SDKs or security updates that are needed. and keeping those in mind with the approval process as you move forward. Finally, there's maintenance. There's maintenance involved across the entire development lifecycle, but specifically when you're talking about mobile deployments, we talk about maintaining a few different things. One is the development stack requirements. Again, this involves keeping up to date with API SDK requirements for the app stores and matching those back to a matrix of the different versions of your application, the different types that exist out there, whether those are different build types, different versions, different platforms, different APIs and SDKs. All of that needs to map back to ensure that you are meeting those requirements. Then there's the build stack requirements. Again, this is the infrastructure, hardware, and software that is needed in order to create the build for your application before it can be deployed. There you may have build requirements because of the type of framework that you're using to develop or language that you're using to develop. You may be leveraging APIs or libraries that you need to ensure exist in order to create the build. Then there's also the standard requirements, for Android or iOS, the SDKs and the dependencies there, and making sure that you have the most recent versions of those. Again, this is all mapped back to the matrix of the types of versions that you have. So the development requirements and the build stack requirements will all be specific to the types of builds, the versions, and the environment that you're using. Then there's maintenance of certificate and credentials management. This is managing your certificates, your App Store credentials, build environments. These all need to be either organized typically in a secure environment to ensure that you are using the most recent certificate and credentials for your builds, that they're not expiring, or that you haven't lost access to them. And finally, again, there's the build environment management, ensuring that you're deprecating old build stacks, that there's not long-standing environments that are still running that don't need to be, and ensuring that you're being efficient as you procure hardware and software for your builds. All right, so those are all of the things that you need to consider as you are creating your mobile CI/CD pipeline or customizing an existing CI/CD pipeline to also deploy native applications. Let's talk about some different strategies that you can use to implement a mobile CI/CD pipeline. Now, this can be whether you are updating your existing strategy, whether you are deploying mobile applications for the first time, or whether you're just a new team getting up and running and deciding how to implement a strategy. So one of the options is to upgrade your existing traditional CI/CD to ensure that it has what is needed for mobile deployments. This will typically involve leveraging an existing CI/CD or DevOps team. This will involve, again, cross-platform knowledge and cross-functional knowledge to ensure that the CI/CD and DevOps teams are up to date on the requirements for mobile deployments so that they can happen quickly. Mobile development teams want to release quickly for the best experience for the developers and users, and they'll have to work very closely with CI/CD or DevOps teams to ensure that this can occur. They'll also need to make sure that they can provision the required hardware and software. If there's not existing Mac hardware or there's not existing build stacks already for mobile, this will need to be managed and incorporated alongside any build stacks for web or existing software. You'll also need to implement systems and processes to support mobile deployments across teams. So if you do have a web or PWA team, an iOS team, an Android team, or if you are developing cross-platform with a cross-platform tool or a hybrid development tool, regardless, you'll need to make sure that there's strong communication and processes in place so that resources can be provisioned and deployments can go out without stepping on each other. You'll also likely need to increase resources to speed up releases. This is just if you may need to have concurrent builds if you are building for multiple different versions at the same time or different platforms at the same time to ensure that you can redeploy to users as quickly as possible. Another option is to let mobile development teams manage the deployments. So in this case, development teams will own their own mobile deployments. This will require education the other way, where the development team will need to get some additional context on CI/CD practices and tooling for their organization. They may need to provision and manage their own resources. So that may include, getting some cloud machines available in order to run their native builds. And it also may involve having their own management system to ensure that they have their build environments and dependencies. There also will need to be dev team compliance with any organizational CI/CD security and vendor requirements. So if you're not leveraging a dedicated infrastructure team, the development teams may not be up to speed on all those processes that are required, especially if you're at a larger enterprise where you may have very stringent validation, security verification, or vendor-specific processes. So the development team will need to be up to speed on those in order to manage their own mobile deployments. Finally, you can also leverage a mobile CI/CD platform. So this would provide cloud-managed hardware and build stacks. There's typically less knowledge requirements for CI/CD or mobile deployments because things are automated by the platform. There will still be some strategy decision-making that needs to take place, but this could be owned by the mobile development team or a DevOps team. They typically also manage the cloud environments, including custom build environments for those different version types, as well as certificate management, again, for those different build environments for different build types. And it does allow for consistent tooling across teams. So if you do have those separate, iOS, Android, or if you have cross-platform teams, you can have consistent tooling on a single platform without having to manage those independently. So again, the options for integration strategies include allowing your traditional CI/CD team to manage with upgrades for mobile, allowing your mobile development teams to own their own deployments, or you can also leverage a mobile CI/CD platform. Thank you so much for joining today. If you do have any questions, again, you can reach me at Cecilia Creates on Twitter or GitHub. You can also reach the team here at Ionic at devrel@ionic.io. We work with thousands of teams to help them deploy their mobile applications, including enterprise teams, and are happy to answer any questions that you may have about how to implement a mobile deployment strategy at your organization. And thank you so much. It looks like we do have a few minutes for questions, if anybody does have any questions. Okay. So as you see, are there any recommended resources to learn about mobile specific processes? For example, app release processes, the Apple Store certificate management. Yeah, so there are definitely some recommended resources that you can leverage outside of traditional documentation. Ionic and AppFlow does have considerable cookbooks and tutorials on our site and our documentation in order to understand what those may be for iOS and Android, because we do deploy to both. And then there are some additional tutorials and examples out there that you can take a look at. But understanding the processes is definitely a learning experience. Okay, great. Thank you so much again for being here. And if you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter, or you can email us again at devrel@ionic.io.